An old name survives in broken clay, not in one perfect story, not in one sacred book, in fragments, in damaged tablets, in lines copied by scribes whose worlds vanished thousands of years ago. The Anunnaki appear there like figures seen through smoke, sometimes many, sometimes few, sometimes tied to heaven, sometimes to judgment, sometimes to the deep and uneasy places beneath the earth. And yet, from these broken records, one of the most misunderstood myths in history was born. Before we chase the modern noise around this name, we have to slow down. The Anunnaki were not preserved for us as a simple answer. They came down through ruins, translations, arguments, and missing pieces. What survives is not a clean doorway into the past, but a cracked one. So tonight, we begin with the clay itself, the fragile witness that carried gods across millennia. In ancient Mesopotamia, a name could outlive a city. A temple could fall. A king could be erased. A language could grow old in the mouths of strangers. And still, pressed into clay, a divine title might remain. The Anunnaki are one of those surviving names. They belong to a world where gods shaped kingship, death, law, flood, fertility, and fate. A world where heaven and earth were not separate ideas, but a single charged system of power. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. Because the real mystery is not simply who the Anunnaki were. It is how a damaged, shifting class of ancient gods became something far stranger in the modern imagination. Chapter 2. Before the myth became a conspiracy. Before the Anunnaki became a favorite name in modern theories about lost planets, alien engineers, and secret origins, they belonged to a much older and stranger world. Not a science fiction world, a religious one. And that distinction matters. Because when most people hear the word Anunnaki today, they often hear it through a very modern echo. The name arrives already surrounded by metal spacecraft, hidden bloodlines, genetic experiments, and the suggestion that human civilization was not built by human hands at all. It is a powerful idea. Not because it is well supported by ancient evidence, but because it satisfies a familiar hunger. It gives history a hidden author. It turns broken tablets into classified documents. It makes myth feel like leaked technology, but the ancient texts do not speak that way. In the older Mesopotamian material, the Anunnaki are not described as visitors from another planet in the modern sense. They are divine beings, gods or godlike powers, moving within the religious imagination of Sumer, Akkad, Babylonia, and Assyria. They belong to temples, rituals, royal ideology, underworld judgments, myths of creation, and the ordering of the cosmos. They are not introduced as a species with a homeworld and a technological mission. They are part of a sacred landscape in which divinity was understood as the invisible machinery behind everything that mattered. Rain, grain, kingship, death, war, fertility, law, the dangerous rhythm of rivers. To the people of Mesopotamia, these were not merely natural or political events. They were signs of divine agency. A harvest could reveal favor. A flood could announce anger. A king did not simply rule because he was strong. He ruled because, in some sense, power had been placed upon him by forces greater than human argument. The gods did not sit politely at the edge of life. They were woven through it. That is the world in which the Anunnaki make sense. The difficulty is that modern readers often approach ancient myth with the wrong kind of suspicion. They assume that if a story contains gods descending, divine councils, strange beings, or the making of humankind, then it must be hiding a literal technological event beneath symbolic language. But ancient myth was not a failed attempt at modern engineering. It was a different language for reality. It explained hierarchy, fear, obligation, mortality, and the fragile bargain between humans and the powers they believed sustained the world. This does not make the myths simple. It makes them more interesting. A conspiracy asks us to flatten the ancient world into a puzzle with one secret solution. Mesopotamian religion refuses to be flattened. It is layered, regional, inconsistent, and alive with revision. A god could have different names in different languages. A divine group could change its membership depending on the text. A myth could be copied, adapted, and repurposed across centuries. The Anunnaki are especially difficult because they do not appear as one stable cast of characters marching through one official storyline. They are a category, a collective, a shifting divine assembly whose meaning depends heavily on where and when the text was written. That uncertainty has made them vulnerable to reinvention. When evidence is fragmentary, imagination rushes in. A missing line becomes a doorway. A damaged tablet becomes an invitation. A word with a debated meaning becomes a place where almost anything can be projected. And once a modern theory becomes more exciting than the ancient material, the older world begins to disappear behind its own distortion. The result is strange. The Anunnaki are famous, but not always known. Their name circulates widely, yet the religious world that produced them is often ignored. The scribes who preserved the texts are pushed aside. The cities that worshipped the great gods become scenery. The long tradition of Sumerian and Akkadian literature becomes raw material for a much newer story. In that newer story, ancient people are often treated as if they could not possibly have imagined complexity on their own. Their gods must have been machines. Their myths must have been misunderstood science. Their temples must have been evidence of outside instruction. There is a quiet insult hidden in that assumption. It underestimates ancient intelligence. The people of Mesopotamia were not naive children staring at the sky without thought. They built administrative systems, calculated grain, tracked celestial movements, developed legal traditions, composed poetry, organized labor, negotiated irrigation, and preserved stories with extraordinary care. Their myths were not random fantasies. They were sophisticated cultural instruments. They helped explain why the world was ordered the way it was, why humans owed labor to the gods, why kingship needed divine approval, and why death remained an unavoidable boundary. To read the Anunnaki only as aliens is to miss the deeper human question inside the myth. Why did people imagine divine assemblies at all? Why did they picture fate as something decreed by powers beyond appeal? Why did the dead require judges? Why did kings need heaven behind them? Those questions lead us much closer to the ancient evidence than any modern fantasy of hidden astronauts. This does not mean we should drain the story of mystery. The Anunnaki are mysterious precisely because the evidence is not tidy. Their role changes. Their number is not fixed. Their associations move between heaven, earth, and the underworld. In some contexts, they are connected with the highest gods. In others, they stand among the powers of the netherworld. Sometimes they seem majestic and remote. Sometimes they appear almost bureaucratic, like a divine court whose decisions cannot be appealed. That is unsettling enough without adding spacecraft. There is also a difference between mystery and permission. A gap in the record does not allow us to place anything we want inside it. Responsible storytelling has to live with uncertainty. It can lean toward the dark, the strange, and the unresolved, but it cannot pretend that every absence is evidence. The broken parts of the tablets matter. So do the surviving parts, and the surviving parts point us toward religion. They point toward a civilization trying to understand power. Power above the king, power beneath the earth, power written into fate before any individual life could resist it. The Anunnaki were not merely characters in stories. They were part of a worldview in which humans existed inside a cosmic chain of command. To modern ears, that may sound oppressive, even frightening. But to ancient communities, it also offered structure. The universe had authorities. The world was not random. Disaster might be interpreted. Order might be restored. Ritual might reach the unseen. Whether that comfort was real or fragile is another question. But it was human. And this is where the modern conspiracy version becomes less compelling than the ancient myth it tries to replace. Aliens give us spectacle. The old gods give us psychology. They show us people looking at kings, storms, graves, laws, and hunger, then asking what kind of invisible order could bind all of it together. They show us a society where the sacred was not decoration, but infrastructure. So before the Anunnaki can be understood, they have to be rescued from the story that made them famous, not erased from modern imagination, not mocked out of existence, simply returned for a while to the clay tablets, to the temple cities, to the languages that carried their name, and to the ancient fear that the deepest powers of the world might not be personal, gentle, or even fully knowable. Only then does the name begin to breathe again. Not as a secret race from the stars, but as something older, heavier, and perhaps more revealing. A group of gods shaped by the needs, anxieties, and ambitions of the first great cities. Chapter 3. The world that needed the Anunnaki. To understand why the Anunnaki mattered, you have to imagine a world where the border between human life and divine power was almost impossible to draw. Mesopotamia was not a single kingdom at first, neatly ruled from one capital with one official story. It was a landscape of city-states, each with its own pride, its own temple, its own patron gods, its own memory of disaster and survival. Cities such as Uruk, Ur, Nippur, Eridu, and later Babylon were not just settlements of mud brick and labor. They were sacred machines, built around the belief that human order depended on cosmic order. At the center stood the temple, not simply as a place of prayer, but as an institution, a storehouse, a workplace, a political symbol, a house for the god. The temple gathered grain, organized offerings, employed workers, and reminded everyone that the city did not belong only to its human residents. It belonged, in a deeper sense, to the divine presence believed to dwell there. This is one of the first things modern imagination often gets wrong. We tend to separate religion from economics, myth from government, ritual from administration. In ancient Mesopotamia, those separations would have felt much less obvious. A canal was not only an engineering project, it was survival. A boundary stone was not only a legal marker, it was a statement about order. A king was not only a military leader, He was someone whose legitimacy needed to be placed within a divine pattern. The gods were not decorative. They were the architecture behind reality. And in such a world, a divine collective like the Anunnaki was not just a group of mythological names. It was a way of imagining the highest pressures bearing down on human existence. Fate, law, death, fertility, punishment, kingship, the terrifying possibility that the universe had already made decisions before any person understood them. Mesopotamia needed gods who could explain both abundance and ruin, because the land itself was never gentle for long. The great rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, made civilization possible, but they did not behave like tame servants. Their floods could nourish fields or destroy them. Irrigation demanded cooperation, measurement, authority, and constant repair. Too little water meant hunger. Too much water meant collapse. A broken canal could become a political crisis. A bad harvest could become a theological problem. When life depends on forces larger than the individual, people look for meaning in those forces. That does not mean they were foolish. It means they were human. The same river that feeds your children can also erase your house. The same king who protects the city can also demand your labor. The same temple that anchors communal life can also remind you that you are small within a vast hierarchy. Mesopotamian religion grew in that tension. It did not offer a soft universe. It offered a structured one. The gods had rank. The cities had rank. Humans had duties. Kingship descended from above, or at least claimed to. Even the heavens seemed to speak in patterns, watched carefully by specialists who believed that celestial signs could warn of earthly events. The world was full of messages, but they were not always comforting. Into this atmosphere, the Anunnaki appear less like an isolated mystery and more like a necessary idea. A city-state world needs more than local patron gods. It also needs a larger divine order, a council beyond the city walls, a set of powers capable of explaining why destiny itself seems organized. The Anunnaki could serve that imaginative need. They belonged to a cosmos where decisions were made above human reach, where the divine world had its own assemblies, authorities, and judgments. There is something deeply political about that. A divine council mirrors a human court, but it also surpasses it. A king might sit with advisors, judges, generals, and priests. The gods, too, could be imagined as gathered in solemn authority. When myth pictures divine beings assigning fates or confirming kingship, it is not merely telling a story about heaven. It is also teaching people how power should feel: ancient, layered, difficult to challenge, and backed by more than human force. That may sound convenient for rulers, and sometimes it was. Religion could strengthen authority. A king who claimed divine favor had more than an army behind him. He had a cosmic argument. But it would be too simple to reduce all of this to propaganda. Myth also limited kings. It placed them beneath the gods. It reminded even the powerful that they were not the final source of order. A bad king could offend the divine order. A city could fall despite its pride. Human authority was real, but it was never absolute. This is one reason the Mesopotamian imagination feels so severe. It does not flatter humanity very much. In many later traditions, humans might be the center of creation, the beloved focus of divine concern. In Mesopotamian myth, the picture is often more complicated. Humans labor, Humans serve. Humans seek protection, but they also live under decrees they cannot fully understand. Their world is crowded with divine needs and divine rivalries. The gods can be majestic, wise, generous, frightening, impatient, or morally ambiguous. That ambiguity is important. It keeps the myths from becoming simple moral fables. The Anunnaki belong to that ambiguity. They are not easily reduced to good gods or evil gods. They are not villains hiding behind temple walls. They are not heroes descending to rescue humanity. They are powers within a divine order that ancient people saw as necessary, but not necessarily kind. To be governed by fate is to be protected from chaos, perhaps. It is also to be trapped inside decisions made elsewhere. A scribe copying a myth onto clay may not have thought of himself as preserving a mystery for distant strangers. He was working within a living tradition. He knew names, signs, formulas, and stories that belonged to his culture. Yet from our distance, the act feels almost miraculous. A reed stylus presses into wet clay. A god's name is fixed there. A tablet dries. A city burns, floods, or empties. Languages shift. Empires pass. And still, the impression remains. But the impression is not the whole world. This is where caution begins. The surviving tablets are not a complete library of Mesopotamian belief. They are pieces. Some come from scholarly settings. Some preserve myths copied long after they first circulated. Some reflect local theology. Others show later reworking. We are looking at a civilization through a damaged window, and it is tempting to mistake the cracks for hidden design. Still, enough survives to reveal a pattern. The Anunnaki emerged from a culture that imagined reality as a hierarchy of visible and invisible powers. They made sense in a world where cities belonged to gods. Kingship required sacred approval, and death was not an escape from order, but another region within it. They answered, or at least shaped, some of the oldest civic questions. Who commands? Who obeys? Who judges? Who assigns destiny? And what happens when human life collides with forces it cannot bargain with? That is why the Anunnaki endured, not because they were simple, because they were useful to think with. They gave form to pressures no city could avoid: the pressure of the river, the pressure of the throne, the pressure of the grave, the pressure of law, the pressure of wondering whether your life had already been weighed in a place you could never enter. And once you see the world that needed them, the name begins to lose its modern costume. It no longer has to be dragged into laboratories or spacecraft to feel powerful. It already belongs to something immense. The attempt of the first cities to imagine the invisible government of existence. Chapter 4. The name no one fully agrees on. The name itself is a problem. That may sound like a small thing, almost academic, the kind of detail that belongs in the footnotes while the real story moves on. But with the Anunnaki, the uncertainty of the name is not a side issue. It is the first warning. We are dealing with a word that crossed languages, centuries, scribal traditions, and religious systems. In Sumerian, the form often appears as Anunna. In Akkadian, it appears as Anunnaki or Anunnaku. Even before we ask who they were, we have to face the quieter question: what did people think they were saying when they used that name? The answer is not as clean as modern mythmakers would like. A common rendering connects the name with ideas of princely or noble divine beings, sometimes explained in relation to An, the sky god, and a group of descendants or offspring. But the details are debated. and the meaning is not something we can lock into one perfect English phrase without losing some of the difficulty. Ancient words do not always travel neatly. They carry grammar, theology, local assumptions, and habits of use that may not survive in any single translation. This is where the mystery becomes more honest, not louder, more honest. Because a word like Anunnaki did not function like the name of a modern organization printed on a sign. It was not a registered title with a fixed membership list and a clear mission statement. It appears in texts where the divine world is already layered and flexible. Sometimes the term seems to point toward a high divine group. Sometimes it is connected with gods of the underworld. Sometimes it appears in ways that suggest rank, authority, or collective power without giving us the comfort of a full explanation. That slipperiness matters. Modern audiences often want ancient names to behave like modern categories. We want one definition, one origin, one secret, one final answer we can underline. But Mesopotamian religion did not develop as a tidy encyclopedia. It grew across cities, languages, dynasties, and centuries of copying. A name could survive while its emphasis shifted. A divine title could expand, narrow, or move into new theological surroundings. The Anunnaki are preserved inside that movement. Think of the clay tablets not as one book with missing pages, but as scattered records from a long conversation. One scribe copies a myth in one city, another writes a ritual text somewhere else. A later scholar preserves an older tradition, perhaps already adapted. A Babylonian theologian arranges the gods according to a newer political vision. Across all of this, the name remains recognizable, but not perfectly stable. That is not a failure of the ancient sources. It is part of what the sources reveal. The ancient world did not always need the kind of precision we demand from it. Religious language often works by force of association rather than by strict definition. A divine group can be understood by what it does, where it appears, who it stands near, and what kind of authority it seems to possess. The Anunnaki were meaningful because they belonged to the highest and deepest structures of divine order. Their exact boundaries could vary, but the atmosphere around the name remained heavy. The problem begins when modern interpreters treat uncertainty as a blank space. A debated translation becomes an opportunity. A changing role becomes proof of concealment. The lack of a fixed definition is presented as if ancient scribes were hiding a technological secret. But that is not how evidence works. If anything, the instability of the name points in the opposite direction. It shows us a religious concept shaped by many hands, not a single hidden record waiting to be decoded. There is a lesson here about humility. The name Anunnaki feels powerful partly because it is incomplete. It resists the neatness we try to impose on it. The more carefully we look, the less it behaves like a label from a modern archive, and the more it behaves like a living ancient term, used, reused, translated, absorbed, and reinterpreted. Even the shift between Sumerian and Akkadian matters. Sumerian and Akkadian were not simply two fonts for the same idea. They belonged to different linguistic worlds, though deeply intertwined in Mesopotamian culture. Sumerian remained prestigious in scribal and religious contexts long after Akkadian became the common language of daily administration and empire. So when a divine name moves between these languages, it does not merely change its sound. It enters a new field of explanation. Akkadian scribes inherited, translated, and reorganized older Sumerian traditions. They did not always preserve them like museum glass. They made them speak to their own world. The Anuna could become Anunnaki or Anunnaku, and the name could continue living inside a changing theology. That is why a single definition can be misleading. It gives the illusion that once we know the etymology, we know the gods. But names are not fossils by themselves. They are clues. Useful clues, sometimes beautiful ones, but still clues. To understand them, we have to watch how they move through stories, divine lists, ritual language, and mythic scenes. A name can tell us where to look. It cannot, by itself, rebuild the vanished temple. There is also something revealing about our impatience with uncertainty. The damaged word bothers us. The disputed meaning bothers us. The shifting usage bothers us. So we try to repair it too quickly. We patch the broken places with certainty, because certainty feels like control. Ancient scribes may have known exactly how the term felt within their tradition. We do not. We are hearing it from far away, through languages that have had to be reconstructed, through tablets that are sometimes broken at the very point where we most want them to speak. And yet, the name survived. That survival is astonishing. Civilizations do not vanish in a single dramatic moment. They thin out, transform, get conquered, absorbed, misremembered. Their languages lose living voices. Their gods lose worshippers. Their temples become ruins, then mounds, then places where someone digs and finds hardened clay marked with signs no one nearby can read. The Anunnaki crossed that entire distance, not intact, but present. And perhaps that is why the name has attracted so much modern invention. It sounds ancient enough to carry authority, obscure enough to invite fantasy, and powerful enough to feel like it should mean something enormous. In a sense, it does. But the enormous thing is not a hidden space empire. It is the depth of Mesopotamian religious imagination, a world in which divine order was so vast that even the names of its powers could not remain simple. The uncertainty around the word should not weaken the story. It should deepen it. A perfectly defined Anunnaki would be easier to explain and less interesting to follow. The real Anunnaki are harder. They come to us as a name with edges worn down by time, a collective whose identity changes depending on the surviving text, a divine category that refuses to stand still for modern convenience. So the safest answer is not the smallest one, and not the wildest one. What we can say with more confidence is that the Anunnaki belong to the upper and lower architecture of Mesopotamian divinity. They were associated with authority, ancestry, judgment, and cosmic order. Their name moved through Sumerian and Akkadian tradition, gathering meanings rather than surrendering to one. That may feel less satisfying than a single translation carved in stone, but it is closer to the clay. Chapter 5. Children of the High Gods. The Anunnaki were never easiest to understand, as a crowd of minor spirits gathered at the edge of someone else's religion. They stood too close to power for that. Again and again, when their name appears in Mesopotamian tradition, it carries the weight of rank. They are not simply wandering supernatural beings. They are attached to the highest architecture of the divine world, to gods whose names could define cities, shape royal authority, and organize the imagined structure of the cosmos itself. But here, too, the evidence refuses to behave neatly. There is no single ancient tablet that opens like a family album and tells us, with perfect consistency, exactly who belonged to the Anunnaki in every period. That is a modern expectation placed on an ancient religious system that was far more fluid. In some texts, the Anunnaki seem to be the great gods as a collective. In others, they appear as a broader divine class. In still others, their presence is felt more through function than through membership. They decree, judge, assemble, or stand in solemn relation to fate. So when we speak of them as children of the high gods, we are not describing one simple bloodline. We are entering a world where divine ancestry, authority, and cosmic office overlap. At the summit of that world was An, or Anu in Akkadian, the sky god whose name itself could suggest the height and remoteness of heaven. Around him gathered other immense figures. Enlil, often associated with command, air, authority, and the ordering force of the world. Enki, known in Akkadian as Ea, linked with wisdom, waters, craft, and creation. Ninhursag, a great motherly and earth-connected figure. Nana, or Sin, the moon god. Utu, or Shamash, the sun and justice-bearing god. And Inanna, later known as Ishtar, whose power crossed love, war, desire, sovereignty, and danger. Different traditions bring different figures near the Anunnaki. Sometimes these gods are named among them. Sometimes they appear above or around them. Sometimes the relationship feels less like membership in a club and more like participation in a divine order. That difference matters. A modern reader might ask, were Enlil and Enki Anunnaki or not? The honest answer depends on the text, the period, and the theological frame. Ancient religion often allowed such categories to breathe. A god could be part of a collective in one context and stand as a leading power over that collective in another. This is not contradiction in the modern sense. It is the flexibility of mythic language. The Anunnaki were not a caste list. They were a way of speaking about divine rank. And rank was everything. Mesopotamian gods were not imagined as equal personalities floating in a democratic sky. Their world had hierarchy, tension, seniority, jurisdiction. Some gods commanded, some advised, some executed judgment. Some guarded thresholds no living person could cross. This divine order reflected human order, but it also made human order feel smaller. Kings, priests, scribes, and laborers all lived beneath a cosmos where authority had already been arranged long before any human throne was built. That may be why the Anunnaki feel so heavy in the surviving texts. They are rarely charming. They do not behave like household gods brought close for comfort. Their presence suggests assembly, decision, and consequence. They belong to the cold room of divine government. Yet they are not faceless. The great gods associated with their world had distinct personalities and domains. Enlil could appear as the stern center of authority, the power whose decisions carried terrifying force. Enki could appear as cunning, intelligent, and strangely sympathetic, often connected to the arts of making, preserving, and advising. Ninhursag brought the deep authority of birth and earth. Shamash illuminated judgment. Sin measured time through the moon. Inanna unsettled every boundary she crossed. To place the Anunnaki near such beings is to place them near the nerve center of Mesopotamian imagination. This is where the story becomes more than a list of names. The Anunnaki show how ancient people thought power worked. Power was not merely strength, it was placement. A being mattered because of where it stood in the cosmic order, whom it could approach, what decrees it could confirm, what boundary it could enforce. A god's importance was not just personal, it was structural. The Anunnaki are structural gods. They hold meaning because they stand within the system. That is why reducing them to a single species, family, or secret race damages the older material. It turns a theological category into a modern plot device. The ancient sources are stranger than that, and more disciplined. They show divinity as layered authority, sky above earth, earth above the netherworld, city beneath patron god, king beneath divine decree, human life beneath fate. In that system, the Anunnaki are powerful partly because they are collective. A single god can be imagined emotionally. A collective is more difficult. A divine assembly feels less personal, more institutional. You can pray to a god. You can plead with a judge. But what do you do before a council whose decision has already become the shape of reality? That is the unease at the center of their name. They are close to the great gods, but not always reducible to them. They are numerous, but not always countable. They are invoked as a group, but the group changes shape depending on the surviving source. They are ancient, but not frozen. Every attempt to pin them down completely seems to leave something moving just outside the frame. And perhaps that is how they functioned best. Not as a perfectly defined family tree, but as a pressure in the mythic universe. The Anunnaki gave weight to divine decisions. They made fate feel witnessed. They made kingship feel ratified by more than one sacred power. They made judgment feel collective, not arbitrary. In a world where law, land, and life depended on order, the idea of a great divine assembly carried enormous imaginative force. It also carried fear. Because collective authority can be reassuring when it protects you, it becomes terrifying when it turns against you. If the high gods and their divine company decree something, what human voice can undo it? If destiny is set in the council of powers, what argument can reach that far? This is not the fear of monsters. It is the fear of administration raised to a cosmic scale, a universe with paperwork, but the paperwork is fate. There is a faint, dry humor in that, but also something painfully recognizable. Human beings have always known the anxiety of decisions made elsewhere. In palaces, courts, offices, councils, rooms where ordinary people are not invited. Mesopotamian myth lifted that anxiety into heaven and below the earth. The Anunnaki became part of the imagined machinery by which existence itself was governed. So when the texts associate them with Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, Sin, Shamash, Ishtar, and the other towering divine figures of Mesopotamia, the point is not simply genealogy. It is authority by proximity. They belong near the gods who organize the world, and that makes them more mysterious, not less. Because the closer they stand to the center, the more their shifting identity matters. They are not a marginal curiosity. They are a sign that Mesopotamian religion could imagine power as both personal and collective, named and unnamed, intimate to the city, yet remote beyond human reach. The Anunnaki were children of the high gods only in the broadest, most mythic sense. Born from a world where heaven had rank, where divine names carried political force, and where humanity understood itself as living beneath an order older than memory. They were not simply the gods in the story. They were part of the structure that made the story possible. Chapter 6. Enlil, Enki, and the Machinery of Heaven. If the Anunnaki belonged to a larger divine order, Then two names stand near the machinery room of that order: Enlil and Enki. They are not the whole story. Mesopotamian religion was far too layered for that. But when modern audiences try to understand the world surrounding the Anunnaki, these two gods help reveal the shape of the system. One seems to gather authority around him like storm pressure. The other moves through myth with intelligence, craft, and a dangerous gift for intervention. Together, they show us that the Anunnaki were not imagined in isolation. They existed inside a divine hierarchy where power had offices, relationships, limits, rivalries, and consequences. Enlil often appears as a central authority figure, especially in older Sumerian tradition. He is associated with command, with the force that separates, orders, and governs. His importance is not merely that he is strong, but that his decisions can feel final. He belongs to the level of divinity where the fate of cities and humans can be arranged from above. If An is the remote height of heaven, Enlil is often the active pressure of authority within the world's order. There is something severe about him, not evil, not in the simple sense. Mesopotamian gods rarely submit to those neat moral categories. Enlil's severity is closer to the severity of kingship, weather, law, and command. He represents the kind of power that does not explain itself fully to those beneath it. In stories where divine decisions become catastrophic for human beings, Enlil can appear as the force that chooses order even when order feels merciless. That may make him uncomfortable to modern listeners. We are used to asking whether a god is loving, just, cruel, or wise. Mesopotamian myth often asks a harder question. What if the universe is governed by powers whose authority is real, but whose motives are not arranged for human comfort? Enki, known in Akkadian as Ea, moves differently. He is associated with wisdom, subterranean fresh waters, cleverness, creation, magic, and technical knowledge. Where Enlil can feel like command from above, Enki often feels like intelligence moving beneath the surface. He advises, he devises, he bends rules without always breaking them openly. In some traditions, he is deeply involved in the making or preservation of human life. He is not simply kind, but he is often more accessible, more inventive, more willing to negotiate the spaces between divine decree and human survival. This contrast has tempted some modern readers to turn Enlil and Enki into a clean rivalry. The harsh ruler and the benevolent rebel, the oppressor and the friend of humanity. It is dramatic, and for that reason it spreads easily. But the older material is less tidy. Enki can help humans, but he remains a god with his own domain and interests. Enlil can bring terror, but he is not merely a villain. Both belong to the cosmic order. Both operate within a theological system where humanity is not the center of every decision. Their tension is meaningful because it is not a simple morality play. It is a way of imagining different kinds of power: command and counsel, decree and craft, authority and wisdom. The Anunnaki stand within this atmosphere. They are not best understood as one family drama where every ancient story can be reduced to two divine personalities fighting over human beings. That version is too modern, too cinematic, and too eager to impose a hero-villain structure. The Mesopotamian divine world was more like a vast court, layered, formal, unpredictable, and full of offices whose boundaries could overlap. The gods assembled, argued, decreed, delegated, and reacted. Their hierarchy could resemble human institutions, but enlarged until it became cosmic. This is what gives the Anunnaki their particular weight. A divine collective matters differently from an individual god. Enlil may command. Enki may advise or create. But the Anunnaki suggests something broader, the assembled pressure of divine rank. Their presence makes a decision feel witnessed by the order itself. They are the council behind the decree, the sacred audience before whom fate becomes more than a private wish. That is why the machinery of heaven is a useful image, if we use it carefully. Not machinery in a modern technological sense, not engines hidden behind clouds. Rather, machinery as structure, parts moving in relation to one another, powers arranged by function. A cosmos that operates through offices and decrees. Mesopotamian religion imagined the world as ordered, but not emotionally simple. The gears were divine, the consequences were human. A king could claim authority because kingship was woven into this structure. A city could rise under divine favor and fall under divine anger. A flood could be read not only as water, but as judgment or disorder breaking through. A human life could be understood as fragile because it depended on decisions made in realms beyond reach. The Anunnaki help populate those realms. They give the unseen order a collective face. And yet, even here, we have to be careful. The surviving texts do not allow us to draw a perfect organizational chart of heaven. We cannot place every god in a fixed box, connect every name with a clean line, and declare the system solved. Mesopotamian religion changed over time. Local traditions mattered. Scribes inherited older material and adapted it. Babylonian theology did not always arrange the divine world exactly as earlier Sumerian tradition had done. So when Enlil, Enki, and the Anunnaki appear near one another in our reconstruction of the mythic world, the point is not to flatten all periods into one map. The point is to recognize a pattern. The Anunnaki belong to a universe where divine power is organized, ranked, and distributed. Their identity makes sense only inside that larger arrangement. This helps explain why they are so easily misunderstood. Modern conspiracy versions often treat the Anunnaki as though they were the main characters in a hidden origin story about humanity. But in the ancient religious imagination, they were not isolated protagonists. They were part of the divine administration of existence. Their importance came from the system around them. Remove Enlil, Enki, the temples, the city-states, the scribes, the underworld, the decrees of fate, and the Anunnaki become a name floating without gravity. Put them back, and the gravity returns. You begin to see why a scribe might preserve their name with care. Not because it pointed to a single secret episode, but because it belonged to the language of cosmic authority. The Anunnaki helped express the idea that existence was governed from above and below by powers both named and collective, personal and institutional. They were not merely beings inside the world. They were part of the way the world was imagined to function. And perhaps that is the deeper unease in their story. A monster can be defeated. A tyrant can be overthrown. A secret can be exposed. But a system is harder to face. The Anunnaki, standing near gods like Enlil and Enki, suggest a universe where power is not always held in one pair of hands. It is distributed through councils, decrees, offices, and ancient relationships. It surrounds human life before human life can answer. That is older than conspiracy, and far more haunting. Chapter 7, The Decreers of Fate. There is a particular kind of fear that does not come from monsters. It comes from the thought that your life may have already been decided. not in a dramatic flash of prophecy, not with a voice from the sky calling your name, but quietly, somewhere beyond reach, in a divine assembly where powers older than your city weigh kings, harvests, punishments, and deaths as if they were matters of order. This is one of the darker centers of the Anunnaki. In several Mesopotamian traditions, they are not merely present as divine beings. They are connected with the decreeing or confirming of fate. That word, fate, can feel abstract to us now, softened by poetry or fortune-telling. But in the ancient Mesopotamian imagination, fate was not a vague mood. It was structure. It was the assigned shape of things. A city could have a fate. A king could have a fate. A human life could be placed beneath a decision that no ordinary person could overturn. The Anunnaki, when they appear in this role, become something more unsettling than characters in myth. They become witnesses to inevitability. This is not the same as saying that every Mesopotamian text gives them one identical function. The evidence shifts, as it always does with them. Their role depends on the source, the language, the period, and the theological setting. But the recurring association with divine decision is powerful enough to matter. It tells us that the Anunnaki were imagined near the place where order became binding, and that idea would have been both terrifying and necessary. A society built around cities, temples, kings, fields, canals, and law needed to believe that order had depth. Human rules alone were fragile. A king could be challenged. A boundary could be disputed. A harvest could fail without explanation. But if the divine world itself decreed the structure of reality, then human life existed within something larger than politics or chance. That belief could comfort. It could also crush. Because if fate is decreed above you, then suffering is not merely suffering. It may be part of an order you cannot understand. If kingship is assigned by divine powers, rebellion becomes more than politics. If death belongs to a cosmic system, grief becomes entangled with judgment. The Anunnaki stand close to that cold intersection where meaning and helplessness meet. We should be careful here. It would be easy to turn this into a simple portrait of ancient fatalism, as if Mesopotamian people walked through life passively, believing nothing could be changed. That would be unfair. Their world was full of action. Rituals performed, omens read, prayers offered, laws written, canals repaired, armies raised, treaties made. People tried constantly to negotiate with the unseen. They did not simply surrender, but their efforts took place inside a universe where final authority belonged elsewhere. That is the crucial difference. Modern people often imagine freedom as the ability to invent ourselves without reference to a larger order. The Mesopotamian world imagined human life as embedded inside a hierarchy that began before birth and extended beyond death. To live well was not necessarily to escape fate, but to understand one's place within the arrangement of gods, city, family, labor, and obligation. The Anunnaki gave that arrangement a solemn face. They could be imagined as a council of divine authority, a collective whose decree carried the weight of more than one god's mood. This matters because a collective decision feels different from a personal command. If one god is angry, perhaps another can intervene. If one power is severe, perhaps wisdom can soften the result. But when the divine assembly itself confirms a fate, the door narrows. There is drama in that, but not the noisy kind. It is the drama of a sealed tablet, a decision impressed into clay, no longer wet enough to reshape. That image would have made sense in Mesopotamia. Writing itself carried authority. Administration depended on records, transactions, offerings, rations, laws, and royal claims could be fixed by the stylus. To imagine fate as decreed was, in a way, to imagine existence as written into order. Not necessarily written in the literal sense every time, but given form, made official, placed beyond casual alteration. And here the ancient myth touches something very modern. We still fear systems that decide for us. We fear files, courts, algorithms, institutions, verdicts, borders, markets, and offices where our lives can change through decisions made out of sight. The Anunnaki belong to a much older version of that anxiety. They are divine authority made collective, remote, and difficult to appeal. This does not mean they were evil. That is too small a word for what they represented. They were frightening because they belonged to order itself, and order is not always gentle. A river kept within its channels feeds the land. A river that breaks them destroys it. A law protects one person and condemns another. A king brings stability and demands obedience. Fate, in this sense, is the invisible channel through which life is forced to move. The Anunnaki were connected to the powers that marked those channels. Their role in decreeing fate also helps explain why they could move between heavenly and underworld associations without becoming incoherent. Fate is not confined to the sky. It governs birth, rule, punishment, and death. It begins above, touches earth, and follows the dead below. A divine group concerned with destiny could appear in more than one cosmic region because destiny itself crosses every boundary. That movement is one reason the Anunnaki are so hard to define. They do not stay comfortably in one room of the cosmos. They gather near the high gods, but they also appear near judgment. They belong to divine rank, but also to human terror. They can feel celestial in one context, and chthonic, earth deep, in another. The modern desire to sort them into one category misses the ancient logic. Their power lies partly in the fact that fate has no single address. It is everywhere. For an ordinary person in Mesopotamia, this may have been less philosophical than immediate. A child is born. A field fails. A king dies. A city is defeated. A plague moves through households. A dream disturbs the night. A priest reads an omen. A ruler seeks confirmation. Behind each event lies the question, has something been decided? The Anunnaki do not answer that question with comfort. They answer it with scale. They suggest that human events, even intimate ones, are tied to a divine order too large to see clearly. That is why their mythic presence can feel so heavy. They turn personal fear into cosmic procedure. They make destiny feel administered. And perhaps this is the detail that keeps them from becoming merely exotic. The Anunnaki matter because they show how ancient people gave shape to power that could not be resisted directly. They are not just gods of a lost civilization. They are an image of decision itself, solemn, collective, remote, and final enough to haunt anyone who has ever felt life being determined from beyond the edge of understanding. Chapter 8. Gods of Cities, Not One Universal Cult. One of the easiest mistakes to make with the Anunnaki is to imagine them as if they were worshipped like one single god, one name, one temple, one doctrine, one clear cult. That would be convenient. It would also be misleading. Mesopotamian religion was not organized like a modern institution with a central handbook and a universal membership list. It was local, layered, and deeply tied to the life of individual cities. A god was not merely a symbol floating above the landscape. A god could belong to a city in a special way, inhabit a temple, receive offerings, appear in festivals, shape civic identity, and stand behind the political confidence of a community. Uruk had its sacred personality. Nippur had its prestige. Eridu carried its own religious memory. Ur and Babylon would each gather power around particular divine relationships. These cities were not just places where religion happened. They were religious worlds, each with its own center of gravity. This is why the Anunnaki are difficult. They do not seem to have functioned as one unified deity with one universal sanctuary. They were not worshipped in the same way that a major city god might be worshipped, with a distinctive cult centered around a particular temple household. Instead, their name could refer to different divine groupings depending on the text and context. They appear as a collective, a rank, an assembly, a category of gods whose identity shifts with the theological landscape around them. That may feel frustrating at first, but it tells us something important about the ancient world. The Anunnaki were not famous because they had a single public brand. They mattered because they could be invoked where the idea of divine collectivity was needed. When a text required the presence of great gods gathered in authority, the Anunnaki could appear. When the story moved toward judgment, fate, or the underworld, their name could carry a different weight. Their power did not depend on one temple door. It depended on the role they played in imagining the structure of reality. This is a subtle distinction, but it changes everything. A god with a local cult could be approached through specific rituals, offerings, festivals, and priestly traditions. The relationship between city and deity could be intimate, almost civic. The god protected the city. The city served the god. The temple stood as a visible sign of that relationship. Even when the theology was grand, it had a home address. The Anunnaki are harder to place. They belong less to the emotional closeness of a patron god and more to the solemn background of divine authority. They are the powers gathered behind the curtain of order. Their presence suggests that the cosmos is not ruled by one isolated personality, but by a layered community of divine beings whose decisions shape the human world. That is why asking, "Where was the temple of the Anunnaki?" can lead us in the wrong direction. It assumes they must have functioned like a single god. The better question is, what kind of religious work did their name perform? In some contexts, it gave weight to fate. In others, it gave authority to divine judgment. Elsewhere, it helped describe the vast population of heaven and earth, arranged by rank and function. The Anunnaki could make a myth feel larger than the actions of one god alone. They suggested a council, a system, an order that exceeded any single divine personality. This also helps explain why their membership is so difficult to fix. Local religion did not always require fixed universal categories. A god who mattered deeply in one city might be understood differently elsewhere. A divine list could arrange gods in one way. A myth could dramatize them in another. Scribal tradition preserved older names while adapting them to newer theological needs. The result is not chaos exactly. It is a living system, and living systems are rarely tidy. Modern people often prefer religion to come with clear charts. We want names, ranks, dates, temples, functions, and official definitions. Ancient Mesopotamian religion gives us some of that, but never enough to satisfy the modern appetite for total control. The Anunnaki resist that appetite. They remind us that ancient belief was not built for our filing cabinets. It was built for cities that needed protection, kings who needed legitimacy, farmers who needed water, families who feared death, and scribes who inherited more tradition than any one tablet could contain. In that world, divine identity could be flexible without being meaningless. This is hard for us because we tend to think of flexibility as confusion. But in mythic systems, flexibility can be strength. A divine collective can move where it is needed. It can gather different gods under one name. It can speak to different regions of the cosmos without losing its aura of authority. The Anunnaki could belong near the high gods, then appear near the judges of the dead, because their function was not limited to one local cultic role. They were part of the grammar of sacred power, and grammar changes depending on the sentence. There is a quiet warning here for anyone trying to turn the Anunnaki into a single secret race with one agenda. The ancient evidence does not behave that way. It points not to a hidden empire of beings acting consistently across all stories, but to a religious vocabulary that changed over time. The same name could be drawn into different scenes because the divine world itself was imagined as interconnected. A city god might rule a sanctuary. A sun god might illuminate justice. A moon god might mark time. A goddess of love and war might cross boundaries with terrifying ease. But a collective like the Anunnaki gave the mythic world depth. They made it feel populated by ranks of power beyond the gods most people could name immediately. In a sense, they made divinity feel institutional, not coldly bureaucratic in every case, but structured, layered, full of seniority and consequence, the kind of order where a human being might never know which powers were watching, but would assume that the world was never spiritually empty. This is perhaps one reason the Anunnaki became so easy to misread later. A vague collective can look, from a distance, like a hidden organization. A changing divine category can be mistaken for suppressed information. The absence of one temple can be misused as proof that something has been concealed. But the simpler explanation is also the more historically grounded one. They belonged to a religious system where not every divine name required a separate cult in the way modern readers expect. The Anunnaki were not less important because they lacked one universal temple. Their importance was of another kind. They gave shape to the belief that behind local gods, city rituals, and royal claims, there existed a broader divine order, a gathering of powers, a solemn architecture of authority, a world in which no city stood alone, no king ruled alone, and no human life unfolded outside the reach of unseen decisions. That is why they could appear differently from place to place and still remain recognizable. They were not one god among many. They were the many, gathered under a name that could darken or dignify whatever mythic space they entered. Chapter 9. The Descent Below the Earth. There comes a point in the Anunnaki story where the sky is no longer enough. The great councils, the decrees of fate, the cities beneath divine protection, all of that belongs to a world where power can still be imagined above the living. But Mesopotamian myth does not leave divine authority in the heavens. It follows power downward into the place where ambition ends, where titles are stripped away, and where even a goddess cannot simply command her way back into daylight. This is where Inanna's descent becomes essential. Inanna, known later in Akkadian tradition as Ishtar, is one of the most vivid figures in Mesopotamian religion. She is not easy to domesticate. She is love and war, desire and violence, splendor and danger. She crosses boundaries with a confidence that can feel almost reckless. In myth, she does not remain politely inside one role. She reaches, she claims, she enters spaces that resist her. And in the story of her descent to the underworld, that hunger for crossing becomes fatal. The underworld is not presented as an adventurous kingdom waiting to be explored. It is a realm of no return, governed by laws older than personal glory. Inanna does not go there as an ordinary soul. She goes as a goddess, adorned with the signs of her power. She approaches the domain of her sister, Ereshkigal, the queen of the dead. And at each gate, she is required to surrender something. A crown, a measuring rod, a necklace, a garment. The visible language of authority is removed piece by piece. The scene is simple, almost ritualistic, and that is what makes it disturbing. There is no need for chaos, no need for a monster leaping from the dark. The underworld works through procedure. Gate by gate, Inanna is reduced. The goddess who entered with divine force arrives finally exposed before powers that do not admire her ambition. Among those powers are the Anunnaki, appearing here not as distant figures of heavenly order, but as judges in the realm below. This is one of the most important shifts in their story. Earlier, the Anunnaki could be imagined near the high gods, tied to divine authority and the decreeing of fate. But in the descent myth, their authority hardens into judgment. They are not merely part of the cosmic background. They sit in the place where return is denied, where status does not protect even a goddess from the laws of the dead. That detail changes the meaning of the group. The Anunnaki are not confined to one shining region of divine power. They can belong to the terrifying underside of order as well. If heaven decrees fate, the underworld enforces its final consequence. The same cosmic structure that gives kingship its sacred dignity also gives death its courtroom. This is why Inanna's descent is more than a dramatic myth about a powerful goddess making a dangerous journey. It reveals a Mesopotamian idea that is far colder. No power is meaningful unless it has limits. Even divine power meets a boundary somewhere. Even splendor can be taken off. Even a goddess must stand before judgment. There is a strange honesty in that. Many cultures imagine death as a place where human rank collapses. Mesopotamian myth goes further. It imagines that rank can collapse even for the divine, at least within the logic of the story. Inanna's ornaments are not just decorations. They are signs of identity, office, and force. When they are removed, the myth is not merely undressing a goddess. It is asking what remains when power is separated from its symbols. The answer is uncomfortable. What remains is vulnerability. The Anunnaki, in this scene, do not behave like rescuers. They do not soften the law because the visitor is important. They judge. The mythic tradition describes Inanna being condemned in the underworld, her living force suspended, her return made possible only through intervention and exchange. The exact texture of the story can vary through transmission, but the central movement is clear enough. Descent has a cost, and the realm below does not release what it takes without consequence. This is where modern readings often miss the emotional intelligence of the myth. It is tempting to treat underworld stories as primitive fantasies about death, But Inanna's descent is psychologically sharp. It understands that ambition often imagines itself exempt from limits. It understands that symbols of power can make a person believe they are power itself. It understands that every system has a gate where confidence stops working, and the Anunnaki are placed precisely there. They are the solemn presence at the limit, not a monster at the threshold, not a villain waiting in secret. A court. That is more frightening. A monster can be outwitted. A court can simply decide. The underworld role also helps explain why the Anunnaki became so difficult to summarize. A modern category would prefer them either as sky gods or underworld gods, either creators or judges, either noble ancestors or dark powers. The ancient material does not divide them so cleanly. Their identity moves with the idea of authority. Wherever cosmic order becomes binding, in heaven, on earth, or below, the Anunnaki can appear. Inanna's descent makes that movement visible. The myth also gives us a different angle on Mesopotamian religion itself. This was not a worldview built only to flatter divine glory. It could imagine the divine world as tense, dangerous, and internally bound by rules. Gods could desire, scheme, rage, fear, and suffer consequences. The sacred was powerful, but not sentimental. It did not guarantee comfort. It guaranteed seriousness. And in the underworld, seriousness becomes irreversible. That word matters. Irreversible. The living world is full of negotiation. Offerings can be made. Omens can be interpreted. Kings can appeal to divine favor. Rituals can attempt repair. But the underworld represents the point where ordinary bargaining fails. Once the gates close, power changes language. The Anunnaki are fluent in that language. Their judgment of Inanna is not simply punishment for one goddess. It dramatizes a principle. No one enters the realm of death unchanged. To descend is to be stripped of illusion. To stand before the judges is to discover that identity, rank, and desire do not erase the laws of the deep. That is why this myth still feels alive. It is not only about Mesopotamia. It is about every human fear of crossing a boundary we cannot uncross. The hospital door, the courtroom, the grave, the moment a choice becomes consequence. The instant when a person realizes that charm, beauty, status, intelligence, or force will not open the gate. Ancient myth gives that moment divine faces. Among them, the Anunnaki sit in judgment. And once we have seen them there, beneath the earth, the name can no longer belong only to heaven. It carries the weight of a darker truth. The same powers that help imagine cosmic order also stand at the place where all human order comes undone. Chapter 10. The Judges of the Dead. Judgment changes a god. A deity of the sky may inspire awe. A deity of the city may receive offerings, songs, and festivals. A deity of wisdom may be approached through riddles, magic, and counsel. But a god who judges the dead belongs to a colder region of imagination. There is no harvest to bargain for there, no throne to bless, no canal to repair, no future season in which the mistake might be corrected. The dead arrive after the argument is already over. In some Mesopotamian traditions, the Anunnaki appear among the powers connected with that final court. This does not erase their older associations with the high divine order. It complicates them. The same name that can gather the weight of heavenly authority can also descend into the netherworld, where authority becomes judgment and fate becomes enclosure. That movement is easy to miss if we try to force the Anunnaki into one simple category. Were they gods of heaven? Were they gods of the underworld? Were they judges? Were they ancestors of major gods? The ancient evidence does not hand us one stable answer. What it gives us is more like a set of appearances, different scenes, different theological arrangements, different uses of the same powerful collective name. And the underworld appearances matter because they reveal what kind of power the Anunnaki could represent. Not warmth. Finality. The Mesopotamian underworld was not usually imagined as a paradise of reward or a flaming theater of punishment in the later moral sense. It was a dim, severe continuation beneath the earth, a place governed by its own rules and powers. The dead did not simply vanish. They entered another order, and that order, like the world above, required hierarchy. Even death had administration. That may sound grimly bureaucratic, but it is one of the most revealing features of the ancient imagination. Mesopotamian religion did not picture the universe as a place where structure stopped at the grave. The cosmic chain of command continued downward. There were rulers below, gates below, laws below, and judges below. The dead entered not emptiness, but a system. The Anunnaki, when placed among the judges of that system, become less like a family of gods and more like an institution of consequence. They are the solemn assembly before whom a life or even a divine trespass is no longer open-ended. Their presence suggests that death is not chaos. It is order stripped of mercy. That is a very old fear. Many people fear death as disappearance, but ancient myth often reveals another fear, that death may not be disappearance at all, but arrival, a crossing into a realm where the self is seen, weighed, assigned, and held. The terror is not that nothing answers. The terror is that something does. This is where the Anunnaki become psychologically powerful. They stand for the possibility that existence has witnesses beyond the living. What was done, what was owed, what was decreed, what boundary was crossed, all of it may still matter below the earth. The underworld judge is frightening because he, or they, do not need to chase you. Everyone comes eventually. Earlier, the Anunnaki seemed connected with the high machinery of divine order. Near Enlil, Enki, and the great gods, they helped imagine cosmic rank, fate, and authority. But in the netherworld, those same themes lose their grandeur and become intimate. Fate is no longer a royal decree or a city's destiny. It is the condition of a single soul entering the dark. The scale collapses. The pressure remains. That contrast is one reason the Anunnaki lasted as such a charged name. They could belong to the top of the cosmos and the bottom of it, not because ancient writers were confused, but because authority itself moves vertically. The king rules on earth by divine sanction. The gods decree above. The dead are judged below. The same logic runs through all three realms. Life is governed by powers beyond the individual. The sky and the grave are connected by order. This is not the kind of idea that needs spectacle to be disturbing. It is disturbing because it is coherent. In a world of city-states and temples, law did not end with human courts. The visible court was only one expression of a deeper pattern. A judge in a city might settle disputes among the living. The gods could settle what no human court could reach. And below the earth, the judges of the dead marked the point where no appeal remained visible. The Anunnaki's underworld role also softens one modern misunderstanding. People often assume that ancient myth must be primitive if its categories change from text to text. But the movement of the Anunnaki between celestial and underworld contexts is not necessarily a flaw. It may reflect a more flexible, symbolic intelligence. The same divine collective could be invoked wherever the seriousness of cosmic decision needed to be felt. Above, they dignify fate. Below, they enforce it. That is not contradiction. It is symmetry, and it gives the myth a darker elegance. The powers that assign order are also present where order closes around the dead. The divine assembly does not vanish when human breath stops. It waits in another form, in another chamber of the cosmos, where ambition, beauty, kingship, cleverness, and wealth have very little room left to maneuver. Here, the Anunnaki are not famous because they explain creation. They are powerful because they deny escape. That may be why their underworld image feels more haunting than any modern reinvention. Extraterrestrial theories make the Anunnaki strange by sending them outward, into space, into machinery, into hidden planets. The older myths make them strange by sending them downward, into the one place every ancient listener understood without needing proof. The grave was not speculative. It was near. It was family. It was memory. It was the end of the road outside every city gate. To place divine judges, there was to admit that death was not merely natural. It was political. Not political in the small sense of human parties or policies, but in the deeper sense of rule. The dead entered a kingdom, a realm, a jurisdiction. They passed from the authority of kings and households into the authority of powers no living person could command. In that sense, the underworld was the final state, and the Anunnaki were among its most severe officials. Still, caution is necessary. The evidence does not allow us to pretend that every Mesopotamian believed one exact, consistent doctrine about the Anunnaki judging the dead. These traditions changed. Texts differ. Some details are fragmentary. We are reconstructing a worldview from surviving pieces, not reading a complete theology written for us. But even the pieces reveal a pattern worth respecting. The Anunnaki were not simply death gods, just as they were not simply sky gods. They were powers of order wherever order became ultimate. Their underworld role shows the shadow side of divine authority. The moment when decree becomes judgment, and judgment becomes the condition of the dead. In the end, that may be the most unsettling version of them. Not creators from the stars, not villains in disguise, but judges in a universe where nothing, not even death, was outside the reach of power. Chapter 11. Flood, Terror, and Divine Fear. The flood stories of Mesopotamia do not give us gods who sit above disaster with perfect calm. They give us something more troubling. They give us divine beings who plan destruction, regret it, fear it, argue over it, and then gather around the survival of one human family, as if the future of the world has suddenly become uncertain even to them. That is not the kind of theology many people expect from an ancient myth. We often imagine old gods as simple forces. Thunder gods thunder, war gods fight, death gods judge, creator gods create. But Mesopotamian myth is rarely that flat. Its gods may be powerful, but they are not always serene. They can be divided. They can be impulsive. They can act with terrifying authority and then recoil from the consequences. The flood tradition brings that discomfort into full view. In the version preserved within the Epic of Gilgamesh, The flood is told as a memory from before ordinary history, a catastrophe so great that it explains why one man, Utnapishtim, escaped the fate of other mortals. Gilgamesh seeks him out because he wants the impossible, a way around death. What he receives instead is a story about survival, divine secrecy, and the limits of human hope. The flood is not described as a natural accident. It is wrapped in divine decision. The gods are entangled in it. Some powers move toward destruction. Another divine figure helps preserve life through warning and cunning. The result is not a clean moral lesson. It is a crisis inside the divine world itself. And that is where the story becomes important for understanding the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki belong to this broader religious imagination in which the gods are not distant decorations, but agents in catastrophe. In flood traditions, the great divine order does not hover politely outside human suffering. It is implicated. The same cosmic authority that can decree fate can also unleash terror. The same divine world that legitimizes kingship can become the source of near annihilation. This is why the flood myth still feels morally sharp. It does not let the gods remain comfortable. When the waters rise, the divine world itself seems disturbed by what has been set loose. The gods are described in ancient terms as reacting with fear, grief, or shock. The imagery is startling because it reverses expectations. Human beings are drowning below, but above them, the gods are not portrayed as untouched masters of the scene. They are shaken by the scale of the destruction. That detail matters. It suggests that Mesopotamian myth could imagine divine power as dangerous even to itself. The gods can command forces they do not emotionally control. They can approve a decision whose consequences become unbearable. They can be mighty without being morally tidy. This is very different from the modern conspiracy version of the Anunnaki, where ancient divine beings are often turned into cold planners with a hidden technical agenda. The older myths are more psychologically complicated. They do not show a perfectly organized alien operation. They show a divine society capable of panic. There is something almost human in that, and also something worse than human. A human ruler who makes a catastrophic decision may later regret it, but the damage remains. A divine ruler in Mesopotamian imagination can make decisions on the scale of the world. Regret does not restore the dead. Fear does not lower the waters. The tragedy is not that the gods are emotionless. The tragedy is that their emotions do not protect humanity in time. Flood, in this context, becomes more than water. It is the collapse of order into the very thing order was supposed to hold back. Mesopotamian civilization depended on managing rivers. Canals, embankments, fields, and labor systems all existed because water had to be guided. Water was life when measured and ruin when released. So a cosmic flood is not just a large storm. It is the nightmare of the entire civilization. The river without boundary, the life-giving force turned against the world it sustained. No wonder the gods fear it. The myth understands scale. It understands that catastrophe can exceed intention. It understands that a decision made in the high assembly may become something no one, not even the divine, wishes to watch unfold. And somewhere in the background of that divine assembly, the Anunnaki help us read the mood of the myth. They are part of the world of great powers whose decrees and judgments define existence. If they are present as members of the divine order, then they belong to the same troubling system, a system capable of establishing life, assigning destiny, and permitting devastation. This is not a comforting view of the sacred, but it is an honest one. The people who told these stories lived in a land where destruction did not need to be invented. Cities could flood, crops could fail, armies could burn fields, disease could move through households, a political order could look permanent and then collapse. Myth did not remove that fear. It gave fear a cosmic frame. The flood story says, in effect, yes, disaster can come from beyond you. Yes, the powers above may be divided. Yes, survival may depend on a warning only one person hears. And no, the universe does not always explain itself in a way that satisfies the grieving. That is a severe kind of wisdom. It also helps explain why Gilgamesh's encounter with the flood survivor is so painful. Gilgamesh wants immortality. He wants a loophole in the human condition. But Utnapishtim's story does not open a wide road for him. It shows that survival may happen once, under strange divine circumstances, but it does not become a general human right. The flood survivor is exceptional precisely because everyone else remains mortal. The myth gives Gilgamesh a story of escape in order to teach him that he cannot escape. That is beautifully cruel, and it brings us back to fate. The Anunnaki, as powers associated in some traditions with decree and judgment, belong to a world where human beings cannot simply negotiate their way out of mortality. Even the greatest king must face the boundary. Even the survivor of the flood becomes a figure outside ordinary human life, not a promise that the rest of us can follow him. The gods may regret destruction. They may preserve one man. They may quarrel afterward. But humanity remains small beneath the decision-making sky. This is why Mesopotamian myth can feel darker than many later stories. It does not always reassure the listener that divine power is identical with moral goodness. Power and goodness overlap sometimes, but not always. Wisdom may intervene, but not universally. Authority may restore order, but only after terror has already had its hour. The flood tradition forces us to sit with that contradiction. It shows a divine world that is powerful enough to drown humanity, yet unstable enough to fear its own act. It shows gods who can be majestic and morally troubling at the same time. It shows survival as fragile, not guaranteed. And it places human life under a sky where decisions made beyond our sight can become the weather of history. That may be the most unsettling part. The flood is not just a myth about ancient water. It is a myth about the fear that the powers governing the world may not be fully governed themselves. Chapter 12. Marduk and the Reordering of the Gods. Religions remember older worlds, but they do not always leave them untouched. As cities rise, empires expand, and political centers shift, the heavens can be rearranged to match the earth. A god who once stood within a crowded divine landscape may be lifted higher. Older powers may be assigned new places. Ancient names may remain, but the structure around them changes. This is what makes Babylonian theology so important to the Anunnaki story. By the time Babylon became a great religious and political center, Mesopotamia had already inherited centuries of divine names, myths, cults, and scribal traditions. The task was not to invent a sacred world from nothing. It was to organize an enormous inheritance. And one of the most powerful ways to organize it was through the elevation of Marduk. In the Babylonian creation epic, often known as the Enuma Elish, Marduk rises to supreme authority among the gods. The story is not only a myth of creation, it is also a myth of legitimacy. It explains why Marduk, the god of Babylon, deserves the highest rank. It presents divine power as something confirmed through crisis, victory, assembly, and acclamation. This is theology with politics in its bones. That does not mean the myth is merely propaganda, as if ancient listeners were incapable of sincere belief. It means that religion and political identity were intertwined. When Babylon grew in importance, its god's cosmic position also grew. The order of heaven could reflect the order of empire. A city's rise could be narrated as a divine truth. The Anunnaki appear within this reordering. In the Enuma Elish, the divine world is arranged on a grand scale, and the Anunnaki are assigned within the structure of heaven and earth. They are not erased. They are placed. Their role becomes part of a vast theological architecture centered increasingly around Marduk's supremacy. That placement is a turning point, because it shows, again, that the Anunnaki were not static. They were not frozen in one early Sumerian form, waiting for modern interpreters to decode them. They moved through tradition. Their meaning was reshaped by new theological needs. A name that had once carried one emphasis could be drawn into a different divine map. This should not surprise us. Human societies do this constantly. They inherit old symbols and give them new work. A title once tied to one political order can survive into another. A ritual can outlive the city that gave it birth. A god can be reinterpreted without being forgotten. The old remains, but it is made to serve a new arrangement. The Anunnaki survived because they were useful within these arrangements. They could represent a broad divine class. They could give weight to assemblies of gods. They could stand within the architecture of cosmic authority. In a Babylonian context, where Marduk's elevation required a vast supporting order, the Anunnaki helped populate and dignify that order. But their presence also tells us something more subtle. When a new supreme god rises, older divine groups do not simply vanish. They are repositioned. Their authority may be acknowledged, absorbed, divided, or subordinated. This is not unlike what happens in human politics when a new capital becomes powerful. Older cities keep their histories. Old families keep their prestige. Old offices keep their names, but the center has moved, and everyone must now be understood in relation to it. Marduk's rise does something similar in the divine realm. The mythic universe is not destroyed. It is reorganized. That reorganization is one of the reasons the Anunnaki are so easy to misunderstand. If you take every appearance of their name as evidence of one unchanging group with one unchanging function, the sources begin to look contradictory. But if you understand that Mesopotamian theology changed over time, the contradictions become clues. They show adaptation. They show scribes and priests working with inherited material in a living tradition. The Anunnaki were not one answer. They were part of a conversation across centuries. In the Enuma Elish, that conversation becomes imperial in scale. Marduk does not merely join the gods. He is elevated above them. His authority is recognized by the divine assembly. He receives names, powers, and honors. The cosmos is ordered through his victory and command. This is not a quiet local myth. It is a cosmic coronation. And around that coronation, the Anunnaki help make the divine world feel vast enough to require a ruler. Their presence gives scale to Marduk's supremacy. A king is more impressive when the court is full. A god is more supreme when the divine order beneath him is immense. The Anunnaki, as part of that order, become evidence of the size of the cosmos being arranged. There is a careful lesson here. Ancient myth often speaks in stories, but those stories can carry institutional meaning. Marduk's rise is not only about divine battle, it is about centralization. It is about what happens when a religious world with many older centers is gathered around one dominant theological point. The Anunnaki's changing placement reflects that process. They are still powerful, but power now has a new center of gravity. This is where the clay tablets become politically alive. They do not merely preserve timeless tales, they preserve arguments about order. Who stands highest? Which city matters most? Which god commands the rest? How can older traditions be honored without preventing a newer authority from taking the throne? The Enuma Elish answers those questions in Babylon's favor, but the fact that it needs to answer them tells us something. Divine hierarchy was not a dull chart. It was a contested imagination of the world. To arrange the gods was to arrange meaning itself. For the Anunnaki, this means their identity cannot be separated from history. They belong to myth, yes, but myth was never floating outside human life. As political power shifted, religious emphasis shifted. As Babylon rose, Marduk rose. As Marduk rose, the older divine order had to be re-seen from beneath his shadow. That shadow did not erase the Anunnaki. It changed the light around them. And perhaps this is one of the most important truths about them. The Anunnaki are not mysterious because they hide one perfect secret. They are mysterious because they were carried through changing worlds. Sumerian memory, Akkadian language, Babylonian theology, underworld scenes, fate decrees, divine assemblies, each leaves a mark on the name. By the time modern readers encounter the Anunnaki, they are not meeting a single clean tradition. They are meeting a layered inheritance, one that has already been reorganized many times before modern speculation ever touched it. So when Marduk rises above the gods, the Anunnaki do not disappear into the background. They reveal the movement of history itself, the way old powers are preserved by being rearranged, the way religion absorbs political change, and the way a name can survive by becoming flexible enough to endure. The gods were reordered. The clay remembered. Chapter 13, What the Tablets Do Not Say. The most dangerous part of the Anunnaki story is not what the tablets say. It is what they do not say. A broken tablet has a peculiar power over the imagination. A clear sentence can limit us. A missing line does the opposite. It opens a space. It invites reconstruction, argument, hope, and sometimes fantasy. And with the Anunnaki, there are many such spaces. The evidence survives in fragments, copies, variant traditions, damaged passages, and texts written for purposes that were not always designed to answer our questions. We want a clean biography of the Anunnaki. The tablets give us appearances. We want a fixed membership list. The sources give us shifting divine groupings. We want one function. The tradition gives us authority, fate, heavenly rank, underworld judgment, and changing theological placement. That is not nothing, but it is not everything. And responsible storytelling has to respect both sides of that sentence. What we can say with some confidence is that the Anunnaki were part of Mesopotamian religious thought, connected at different times with major gods, divine assemblies, decrees of fate, and the underworld. What we cannot honestly do is pretend that every question has been answered. Their exact membership is not stable. Their number varies. Their relationship to other divine groups can be difficult to define. Their cultic presence is not as direct or simple as that of major city gods. Their identity changes as Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian traditions reshape the divine world. This is where the story becomes vulnerable. A gap in the record is not automatically a secret, but it can be made to look like one. If a tablet breaks at the wrong place, the missing words may feel suspicious. If a name changes between languages, it may be treated as a code. If a divine group has different roles in different myths, someone can claim that later scribes were hiding the truth. If no single temple of the Anunnaki stands at the center of the evidence, that absence can be twisted into proof of concealment, rather than understood as a sign of how divine collectives worked. The ancient world becomes a courtroom where silence is treated as confession. That is bad history, but it is very effective storytelling. The Anunnaki became famous partly because they are difficult. A simple god with a clear temple and a stable mythology leaves less room for reinvention. A shifting collective of ancient powers, preserved in languages most people cannot read, gives modern imagination much more material to rearrange. The name sounds old. The evidence is scattered. The subject is genuinely complex. That combination is almost impossible for speculation to resist. Yet the gaps themselves are historically meaningful. They remind us that we are not looking at Mesopotamia from inside Mesopotamia. We are looking back after loss. Clay tablets survived better than papyrus, parchment, memory, and breath. But they did not preserve everything. Libraries were destroyed or buried. Texts were copied selectively. Rituals may have been practiced without leaving the kind of evidence we wish they had left. Oral explanations vanished. Local assumptions disappeared because no scribe thought he needed to explain what everyone around him already knew. Much of the ancient world was obvious to the ancient world. That is exactly why it is obscure to us. A scribe did not write for a 21st century viewer trying to understand the Anunnaki after hearing their name in a modern theory. He wrote within a tradition. He assumed categories, gods, scribal training, ritual background, and theological references that may now be only partly recoverable. Even when the words survive, the world around the words may not. This is why humility is not a weakness in this story. It is the only way to see clearly. To say we do not know is not to make the Anunnaki less interesting. It makes them more real. Real ancient evidence is uneven. It has texture. It has damage. It forces patience. The desire to remove every uncertainty too quickly often tells us more about modern anxiety than ancient religion. We want the past to confess. Sometimes it only murmurs. The limited direct cult evidence is especially important. Major Mesopotamian gods often leave clearer traces through temples, offerings, hymns, city associations, and ritual life. With the Anunnaki, the picture is different. Their importance appears more through mythic and theological function than through one easily identified, unified cult. That does not make them imaginary in the ancient sense. It means their role was not identical to a patron deity with one prominent sanctuary and a public civic identity. They operated differently. They belonged to the language of divine order. That difference is easy to mishandle. When modern interpreters ask the wrong question, the answer appears mysterious in the wrong way. Where is their single cult center? May not be the best starting point. How did their name function within divine hierarchy, fate, judgment, and cosmic arrangement? Brings us closer to the evidence. Still, even that better question does not solve everything. There are unclear passages. There are changes over time. There are scholarly disagreements about terminology, classification, and emphasis. The Anunnaki are not a puzzle with one missing piece. They are a damaged mosaic, and some tiles are gone for good. This is the point where speculation often becomes tempting. Not all speculation is foolish. Careful interpretation is necessary when evidence is incomplete. Historians, philologists, and scholars of religion often have to compare texts, trace patterns, weigh probabilities, and make cautious arguments. The problem begins when caution is abandoned, when a possibility becomes a certainty, and when a missing line is treated as if it proves the most spectacular option available. That is how myth becomes distortion. The tablets do not tell us that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial engineers. They do not give us a clear narrative of alien genetic design. They do not describe a hidden planet in the terms popular culture often attaches to them. Those ideas belong to modern reinterpretation, not to what the cuneiform sources securely support. But the tablets also do not give us a dull story. They give us something stranger than certainty, an ancient religious category moving through centuries of human fear and order. They show gods assembled around fate. They show divine authority descending into the underworld. They show political theology reshaping heaven as earthly power shifts. They show a civilization trying to think through the unbearable fact that life is governed by forces beyond ordinary control. That should be enough. In fact, it may be more than enough. Because the gaps in the evidence do not merely hide information. They reveal the conditions under which history survives. The Anunnaki come to us through accident, preservation, scholarly labor, and loss. Every sentence about them stands near an absence. Every confident claim has to be measured against the clay that broke, the text that was never found, the ritual that left no full explanation behind. The silence around them is not proof of a cover-up. It is the sound history makes when most of it has disappeared. And that silence would become the doorway through which a much newer myth entered. Not from ancient Mesopotamia, but from the modern world's hunger for hidden masters, forbidden origins, and answers too dramatic to be checked against the broken clay. Chapter 14. The Modern Reinvention of the Anunnaki. At some point, the Anunnaki left the tablets. Not literally. The clay stayed where it was, in museums, archives, excavation reports, scholarly editions, and the difficult world of ancient languages. But the name escaped into a different atmosphere. It moved from Mesopotamian religion into modern suspicion, from divine councils into star maps, from fate and judgment into secret engineering. And once that happened, the Anunnaki became almost impossible to recognize. The modern reinvention did not begin because the ancient sources suddenly revealed a hidden technological story. It grew from a much newer habit of reading myth as disguised science. In this approach, gods are not gods. They are misunderstood astronauts. Temples are not temples. They are evidence of advanced instruction. Creation myths are not sacred stories about labor, order, dependence, and divine power. They are treated as corrupted memories of biological experiments. It is an attractive method because it seems to unlock everything. It also flattens almost everything it touches. The Anunnaki, in this modern version, are often transformed into extraterrestrial beings who came to Earth, manipulated human origins, and shaped civilization from behind the curtain. The details vary depending on who is telling the story, but the pattern remains familiar. Ancient people saw powerful visitors, lacked the vocabulary to describe technology, and therefore called them gum. On the surface, that may sound respectful. It appears to take ancient testimony seriously. But beneath the surface, it does something more troubling. It assumes ancient people could not have produced complex myth, architecture, astronomy, law, poetry, theology, and political imagination without outside assistance. It treats their religious language as a mistake to be corrected, rather than a worldview to be understood. That is not curiosity. It is a kind of theft. Theft of meaning. Because the ancient Anunnaki did not need spacecraft to matter. They already belonged to one of the most sophisticated religious landscapes of the ancient world. They were tied to questions of rank, authority, fate, kingship, death, and cosmic order. Their ambiguity was not a failure waiting for a modern theory to solve it. It was part of how Mesopotamian divine language worked. The modern alien version replaces that complexity with a cleaner story. Too clean, perhaps. Instead of many cities, we get one hidden plot. Instead of changing theological contexts, we get a single secret agenda. Instead of scribal tradition and linguistic difficulty, we get the promise that the whole past can be decoded if we stop trusting scholars and start reading myths as technical reports. There is a reason this promise spreads. Modern people often distrust official narratives. Sometimes that distrust is earned. Institutions can conceal, distort, and simplify. History is full of missing records, political rewriting, and inconvenient truths buried under power. So when someone says, "The real story has been hidden," the claim lands in a world already prepared to listen. The Anunnaki became useful for that mood. Their name sounds ancient. Their identity is genuinely complicated. The surviving evidence is fragmentary. Most people cannot read cuneiform. The distance between the public and the scholarly material is wide enough for speculation to build a palace in the middle. And that palace has very dramatic lighting. The alien Anunnaki myth offers scale, secrecy, and origin. It tells people that humanity's beginning was not merely difficult, symbolic, or theological, but engineered. It suggests that power has always belonged to hidden beings above us. It makes kingship, labor, religion, and civilization part of a buried program. In a strange way, this modern myth preserves one ancient feeling while changing almost everything else. It preserves the fear of being ruled from above. The ancient Mesopotamians imagined human life beneath divine decrees. Modern conspiracy culture imagines human history beneath hidden controllers. The setting changes from temple to laboratory, from heaven to outer space, from divine council to alien hierarchy. But the emotional structure remains familiar. Ordinary humans live inside a system whose true rulers are distant, powerful, and only partly understood. That may be why the reinvention is so persistent. It is not only about aliens, it is about power. The alien Anunnaki story gives a modern shape to an ancient anxiety, that the forces directing life are not visible to those who suffer the consequences. In Mesopotamia, those forces were gods, fate, kingship, death, and the divine order. In modern reinterpretation, they become extraterrestrial planners, genetic engineers, secret bloodlines, or suppressed knowledge. The mythology changes costume, but the fear underneath remains recognizable. Still, similarity of feeling is not the same as historical evidence. This distinction has to be held firmly. The cuneiform sources support the Anunnaki as divine beings within Mesopotamian religious tradition. They do not securely support the claim that the Anunnaki were a literal alien species. They do not require us to read divine descent as spacecraft landing, or creation language as laboratory procedure. To do so is not translation. It is reinterpretation through a modern lens. And reinterpretation can be creative without being true. There is no shame in admitting that modern myths can be fascinating. They reveal what our own age fears and desires. The alien Anunnaki story tells us that many people today feel alienated from ordinary explanations of history. They suspect that civilization must have a hidden author because the visible story feels too chaotic, too painful, too incomplete. They want the past to contain a master key. But ancient Mesopotamia does not give us a master key. It gives us a locked city with many gates. Some are broken. Some are labeled in languages we had to relearn. Some open into temples. Some into royal ideology. Some into the underworld. Some into myths whose meanings changed as they were copied. The work of understanding them is slower than conspiracy and less instantly satisfying. But it has one great advantage. It allows the ancient world to remain ancient. That matters. When we force the Anunnaki into a modern science fiction frame, we do not uncover Mesopotamia. We overwrite it. We replace its gods with our machines, its scribes with our suspicions, its theological debates with our hunger for hidden technology. We look at a civilization struggling to understand mortality, order, and power, and we say, surely this must have been about us, our science, our secrets, our fears. The older story asks for more patience. It asks us to sit with a culture that did not divide the world as we do. It asks us to hear myth not as failed history, but as symbolic thinking with its own seriousness. It asks us to accept that ancient people could create profound ideas without being handed them by visitors from the stars. The real Anunnaki are harder to market. They do not arrive with a simple diagram. They do not solve every mystery of human origins. They do not turn every damaged tablet into evidence of a cover-up. They belong to a world where gods could decree fate, where death had judges, where kingship needed sacred backing, and where the order of heaven could shift with the fortunes of cities. That world is less flashy than the modern legend. It is also deeper. The modern reinvention of the Anunnaki tells us a great deal about ourselves. It shows how easily mystery becomes merchandise, how quickly uncertainty becomes proof, and how hungry we are for explanations that make history feel secretly planned. But the ancient sources point elsewhere. They point back to clay, to temples, to divine hierarchy, to scribal memory, and to the uncomfortable possibility that the past does not exist to confirm our favorite theories. The Anunnaki were transformed because modern imagination found them useful. But before they were useful to conspiracy, they were useful to civilization. They helped Mesopotamians think about the unbearable weight of existence. Who commands, who judges, who creates, who dies, and who decides what any life is allowed to become. That older myth does not need to be rescued by aliens. It needs only to be listened to without drowning it in our own noise. Chapter 15. Why the Anunnaki Still Haunt Us. In the end, the real mystery of the Anunnaki is not whether beings came down from the sky in machines. That question belongs to the modern world, with its satellites, laboratories, anxieties, and suspicion of official stories. It tells us more about our age than it does about ancient Mesopotamia. The older mystery is quieter and harder to dismiss. Why did some of the first great cities imagine existence as something governed by divine assemblies? Why did they picture fate as a decree? Why did they place judges beneath the earth? Why did kings need heaven behind them before their power could feel complete? The Anunnaki endure because they stand at the crossing of those fears. They are not easy gods. They do not offer one gentle doctrine. Across the surviving texts, they change shape. High powers, divine collectives, figures of judgment, names associated with fate, heaven, earth, and the netherworld. Their instability is part of their truth. They come to us from a world where religion was not a set of clean definitions, but a living system of cities, temples, scribes, rulers, floods, graves, and unanswered questions. That world needed gods who could explain order. But order, in Mesopotamian myth, was not always comforting. A fate can protect the world from chaos, but it can also trap a human life inside decisions made elsewhere. A king can keep a city together, but his authority can become terrifying when wrapped in divine approval. Death can be imagined not as emptiness, but as a jurisdiction. Even the gods themselves could seem divided, frightened, or morally troubling. That is the part worth remembering. The Anunnaki are not haunting because they are hidden aliens. They are haunting because they reveal how ancient people faced the same pressure we still feel. The suspicion that life is shaped by powers beyond ordinary reach. We may no longer call those powers divine councils. We may call them history, empire, bureaucracy, genetics, climate, money, war, algorithms, or chance. The names have changed. The feeling has not. Human beings still live beneath systems they did not create. Systems that assign possibility before a person ever speaks. The Anunnaki gave that feeling a sacred form. They made power visible enough to fear, but distant enough to remain mysterious. And perhaps that is why modern reinventions found them so easy to use. A name already filled with ancient authority could be pulled into new stories about secret control. But the cuneiform evidence points us back to something older and more human. Not a lost technological race, but a civilization trying to understand why the world seemed ordered, cruel, fertile, beautiful, unstable, and final all at once. The broken clay does not give us every answer. It never will. Some names are damaged. Some lines are missing. Some meanings remain debated. The Anunnaki will always stand partly behind the fracture in the tablet, visible enough to recognize, incomplete enough to invite longing. But that incompleteness is not a failure. It is the honest condition of ancient history. We are not owed a perfect past. We are given fragments and asked to listen carefully. So the Anunnaki remain with us, not as proof of a secret invasion, not as characters in a modern fantasy, but as witnesses to one of humanity's oldest intuitions, that behind the visible world there may be an order we can sense, fear, obey, and misunderstand, but never fully command. That is the deeper shadow they cast. Not the shadow of spacecraft over ancient cities, the shadow of fate over human life. And in that shadow, across the ruins of temples, tablets, kings, and vanished languages, the Anunnaki still ask the same question they have always asked without speaking. What rules us when we do not know we are being ruled?